Hello, welcome to Garden Chronicles. I'm James David. In today's video, I'll be talking about roses, and of course, this is very much the whole basic introduction of it. And I'd like to share my thoughts and experience on it. And I really hope you enjoy this particular narratives because I find that over the time, I would like to say about 10 to 20 years of experiencing with roses, and these are the element that I want to talk about when coming to grow roses in a hot tropical humid region, which is totally a different ball game altogether. And many people which I know personally have purchased these roses only to find an element of disappointment, and in the sense to say that I've given up hope when it comes to roses. And I want to share a little bit more on this, on why these roses do not actually grow very well in a hot tropical climate as what you see that is being bought from the nurseries. So I will be covering a little bit more on those details and to understand their characteristics and the tips and hacks. And I would like to share a little bit more on that, especially in a hot and dry climate zone, and also in a situation where it also comes to this place where it rains in a certain time of the months in the part of the year. And so this can be also detrimental for the rose plant, especially when they are grown outdoors. So I'll be covering a lot of those in this particular video. Meanwhile, I'll also have put in a lot of the roses that is available in Sungai Buloh Nursery, just in Malaysia, around the Southeast Asia region. And here I would like to cover on the context of what is available and what have been sold in nurseries, and what are the things that you need to look into it. So stick back and enjoy the show. My tip number one is to say that when you see these roses, consider them as cut plant flowers. It is as if you went to a florist and you saw the roses and you want to keep them, instead of you buying the cut flowers which only going to last you about, say, about a week's time. This particular roses which has been rooted over here most likely is going to stay in bloom at least plus minus in a month's time. So if you were to consider in that kind of context, keeping them indoor, especially in an aircon room, or especially like a indirect light, in a way to say that if this plant do not survive in an indoor setting, consider it as a cut flower plant. That's an acronym that is being used as ABATA, BATA, in a way to say that among gardeners we use this term to say that buy and a throwaway plant. In a way, it says that it's just going to enjoy the blooms, and of course it's much more cheaper and economic in a way to purchase this kind of condition, especially a rose plant, because it's going to last longer and the bloom's going to stay a little bit much longer. And once it's done, you can just toss it and throw it away and get another one. And it's very much economic because these about 4 to 5 flower blooms in this will be roughly about 10 to 15 ringgit in comparison to a one cutting rose flower bloom, which will also cost you that. So in a way to say, you buy one, you get three free, something like that. So in that context, do consider it in that mindset when you were to purchase these particular roses. So in that sense, that if you were to look at it in the same context with the orchids, then often that I've noticed that orchids been purchased and kept in display, especially in the hotels or in any exhibition or something like that. Those orchids will actually last about 1 to 2 months, and once the flowers have already done its cycle and everything has dropped, and they will just uh, change over the whole pot to another set of orchids. So similar like that, these roses fall into that category. That is to say, my tip number one is to consider this as cut flower plants. Now, of course, obviously, especially when it comes to gardeners, they want to keep these roses, these flowers, to be continuously blooming in their garden. So, in that sense, it'll be actually not practical to buy these plants and consider them as cut flowers. So, that is what I'm actually going to arrive here, is to have a mindset to understand that when purchasing these plants, consider them as cut flower plants, but there is another method that I want to talk about, in a way to say, to consider them as to become part of your garden plants. Now, the factor here is this: when you come to these flowers, these are actually grown in cold climate zone region. In most cases, these are actually been brought down from Cameron Highland, which is much more cooler and cold climate zone, which is totally a different ball game altogether when it comes to humidity, weather patterns, and all of that. And when it comes to the hot and wet climate zone, especially in around the Klang Valley region where we are staying, in a sense to say that it is extremely very much like a tropical region. Hence, these flowers, which is extremely delicate, will not able to stand that kind of shock. And this is the reasons why most of these rose buds will sort of like explodes, in a way to say wither, and sort of like yeah, imagine like a bloom is just been blasted in a hot blazing sun. It is going to burn, and you may not able to handle the shock. So how do we handle this is to slowly acclimatize these flowers or this rose plant into the hot and rainy weather climate zone. Now, one of the tips that I want to mention here is that if you were to follow this instruction, way to say is that keep them in indirect bright light area at the part of your garden. Let it finish its blooms, in a way to say enjoy the blooms, and let it just bloom, say about 3 weeks time, and eventually you'll find that a lot of these petals will actually will drop off. Once you have dropped off the petals and you actually have enjoyed it, in a way to say that earlier I mentioned, like keeping them indoors. So once that portion is done, deadhead the flowers, or you can actually use a scissors, a clean scissors, and trim off the flower buds, and also uproot the whole plant out and remove the cocoa peat that is planted together with this. In most cases, which I actually understand, that these are actually not a miniature rose plant. They are actually tall, in a height of about 6 feet, 7 feet high rose plant. What has happened here is that this is actually, they have actually cut these rose buds to a certain height and actually use rooting hormone and just planted it into these pots. And if you notice, it'll be 4 in 1, and that's what is being marketed for a cut plant kind of a display. So you have to notice that that is the actually a marketing strategy. But if you actually want to grow this plant, you have to change the method, or in a way to acclimatize this plant to suit your garden needs. Hence, one of the things is that my tip here is keep them indoors or keep them in an indirect bright light in the part of your garden. Once the flowers has finished its cycle, trim off the, or you can trim off the rose bud or the spent rose bud and unpot them and change the potting media. So these are actually grown fully using cocoa peat. Now the problem with cocoa peat here is that they are not suitable for our lowland climate. And one of the factors here is that when a lot of the gardeners immediately just place them outdoors, of course there will be bud blast and the kind of thing that occurs in the flowers. And after that, because of the weather, the cocoa peats somehow turn into a dry sponge, in a way to say that when it watered, it doesn't actually absorb enough water because it has actually dried up, and sort of like you're just pouring water into it and it just flush out and the roots are suffocated. And in this context, what has happened here is that the plant is actually suffocating, and once there is a root rot takes place, that's the end of the plant. It's a slope all the way down until the whole plant perish. So one of the most important thing is to repot it with the healthy root ball that is already existing. Once that is done, the plant will take its time to acclimatize, and that will you actually notice a lot of leaf drop and sort of like it is adjusting to it. That will at least will take about 1 to 3 months, depending on the type of the rose and the climate zone in your area. Now, once that is established, you will notice that the flower will be totally a different, will have a different appearance from the one that you actually purchase from the nursery. It is because it's due to the factor of condition. The flower will be more open, uh, more behave like a lotus rather than a rose. Now here you can notice that this particular nursery owner has actually repot all these roses. I believe this is actually not for sale. I think this has already finished its glorious moment, and hence they have actually trying to save it using acclimatized zone in a lowland climate. We notice that there's a lot of bud blast, bud drop, even the flowers dried up on the stem. You have to take note of it, the dangers about this sort of like the changeover of climate zone. There will be a lot of rot problems. So as you can see, a lot of leaf rot that is taking place. So you may have to use a fungicide on it if the infection is very bad. Most of the cases is because due to the factor of the root rot that has taken place, or when it, of course, when the plant is in shock and it's adjusting. These are the factors that you have to pay attention to. In most cases, you can actually strip off the leaf that is affected, because this can also be detrimental and can be also infectious in a way that it can actually infect other plants. So do pay attention and be careful in coming to these particular issues, because when it comes to fungus, they can be detrimental to the rose plant. Another point to take note of is that this gardener has actually used a common normal garden mix soil, which is also a little bit fast draining. And I believe the transition of changing over was too late, hence the shock was taken place. And then the gardener has actually repotted it. That's why we notice a lot of drying and burns and death upon this plant, simply because the changeover was taken place too late. If it's been done much more sooner, the gardener may able to save the plant. But however, we've also noticed that during the acclimatizing zone, you notice that the flowers have already adjusted to it, and you can see that it may not show its former glory, but somehow you notice that it is still okay, like in a sense that this has acclimatized to the lowland climate zone flower blooms. If you're still with me until this particular part of this video, I would really appreciate that you can click like, and as this will actually help me in the YouTube algorithm. And above all, if I will also deeply appreciate if you can subscribe my channel if you really enjoy my narratives and tips and my experience on the roses. And also do throw in your comments, one or two, of what your thoughts on these particular roses and experiences, and anything concerning this particular topic. Coming back to the video narrative, here you can actually see how these roses are actually sold here still in their bud form, and I believe that this is newly shipped or brought in from their growing places. Now, one of the things that I want to mention here is that due to the factor of this, in the context of still in the bud formation, you have to pay a lot of care on it, because these are not ready to be exposed to the direct hot sun or open lowland climate zones. In most cases, these are actually sold here in this form is for the other nursery owners to come over here and to purchase them, in a way to say that this is actually a wholesaler kind of a center. So they will actually buy this in bulk, and by the time they bring it back to their respective locations, and by then it'll be about a 1 weeks or 2 weeks time, and the flower blooms will be just ready in their half opening stage. So in a way that is just optimal for their blooming cycle and to attract customers to purchase them. If you notice, most of these roses are not in the miniature form. You can see they're actually quite tall, around 6 feet high or 7 feet high. In this context, this is actually the optimum size that these roses are supposed to grow. So do take note that if you are growing them in your garden, eventually these roses will grow tall. There are another variety known as miniature rose, which is it appears to be more like a tea rose kind of a breed, which is quite rare. I've not really seen it. It normally will come in according to the season. There'll be sometimes there will be a season where this miniature rose will arrive in bulk in the nursery, and so it's sort of like, if I were to say it, like if you're lucky at the right time, the right frame of time, these roses are actually available when they are brought in, it'll be more of that breed. So I have not seen this particular set here in this particular video. I have not found any of those miniature roses types, but that was actually my favorite. I used to grow them before, and I find that it is also very hardy, and it's quite cute because you were to see the tiny formation of the roses, and it's quite lovely to see when they are in bunches. There's another variety known as trailing roses. I believe it's also similar to that, but when it comes to trailing roses, they are not upright. So in a way, there is a lot of varieties that has been brought down and shipped, or in a sense sold in this garden center in a central region. However, one of the things that I find which is quite challenging and is quite normal here is the ID, the identification is not placed. So you will not actually know the identification of these types of roses. All the identification that you actually get is what you see is what you get. In a way to say that you have to follow up in the context of the purchaser were to buy it and look at it by knowing. And in a normal common factor here is that roses are actually bought in the context of the flower size and the colors. Now, coming to my last tip, my tip number 9 is fungicide. And we notice that some of the leaves, you will see something like droplets that has been spread upon it. It has this sort of like this whitish mark on the leaves. Those is actually fungicide that has been actually sprayed on the leaves. And the thing here is that do also pay attention not to consume these roses or smell these roses, because they are actually, there are chemicals being sprayed on these roses. So be wary about it, because together with the fungicide also they have mixed the insecticide on these flowers. So in a way it is sort of like not safe. So do take note about that, unless you want to use the blooms for some deco purpose or display. As for coming on the element of edible flowers or something like that, I'll suggest not to do so, because these are actually been sprayed with heavy chemicals. So one of the things that you have to take note, that when growing these outdoors in a lowland climate, they are actually exposed to two main problems, which is the fungus problem that may occur on the root rod or the leaf rod, and also the insects that actually attacks them. And I find that trips are the main culprit, and sometimes it can even be mealybugs that is farmed by ants, and even scale insects. So these are the notorious insects that actually sort of become like a parasite to this plant and actually make the plant become stressed, and the plant may perish. I actually lost quite a few roses because of this factor. But the fact, the other issue here is that I do not actually have the discipline of constantly spraying pesticide and fungicide on this plant. I find that it's not according to my nature of my gardening, because I really do not want to practice using these kind of insecticides and pesticides on plants, because in a long term it's not going to have full. So do take note of it, that if in case that you face these problems, and if you are planning to grow roses or have a rose garden, this have to be part and parcel of gardening, like a normal gardening regime. So in a way to say that you may have to set time to spray fungicide maybe once a week, and then the next week after that an alternate with insecticide. And also you may also have to use a strong fertilizer on this, because these are actually heavy feeders. They do require good fertilizer on it, and I would recommend bone meal, because I find that bone meal seems to do good, or even cow dung. Somehow it actually works best in a lowland climate zone. The other thing that I want to mention is that pruning is also very important, because lack of which the plant can grow very bushy, and it can use that all its resources in branching out, and it may not bloom as much. So keeping them night clean and tidy actually will actually optimize the blooming cycle. Now, coming to the last portion of this particular video, I want to showcase to you these roses are actually planted in the Lake Gardens KL, and I find that this has been successfully cultivated, and these are the tips that I want to mention to you over here by observation. Here you can actually notice that these roses are quite acclimatized, and one of the factor here is that there is sort of like transparent roof over them in a way to protect the from heavy rain downfall. And one of the factors here is that I believe that when it rains, the rainfall may damage the petals, so in a way this gives a proper coverage. And when it comes to watering, it will be done by the gardener according to the watering regime, which may be very well controlled so that it would not be overwatered, that it may face root rot problem. Another factor that I want to make note of is the indirect bright light that these roses are receiving. You can still see that it is actually having more of an outdoor setting, except for the transparent roof. And this is one of the things that is required when it comes to roses, that they don't do very well in dark shaded garden areas. So in a way to say that if you are actually growing them, they do well actually even on a balcony space, provided they receive full open sunlight but not direct sunlight. In a way to say that it's at least about 12 hours of lighting, in a way that will actually induce them from blooming. Another thing here is, then if you notice that these roses are quite branchy, they do require a good pruning just to keep them more healthy and gives out more blooms. But in a way to say that in a cultivation such as this, I think a gardener may have to pay a lot of attention and care for it. Hence, this is one of the requirements when it comes to roses. They are require high maintenance to cultivate them in the garden. Another factor of pruning is deadheadening. If you have noticed here that the most of these roses have already finished its bloom and is actually dried, and the spent flower buds are still hanging, these are do require to be trimmed and pruned off. Otherwise, these can actually cause fungus infection that may be detrimental for the whole rose bush or plant. So these are the things you have to pay attention when it comes to roses. As I mentioned, they are high maintenance plants. I have now come to the end of my video. If you have enjoyed my narration and my experience and my thoughts on this, do consider click like and subscribe, and hope to see you again in my next video. Take care and have a nice day. Bye.